All right, everybody, as mentioned, welcome to the start of EU at South by Southwest Day 2. We've got a supply chain discussion, Dude, Where's My Camera, commencing off. And with this, I hand it to Jenny Leonard of Bloomberg. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm personally very excited that we're doing this in person, which is also why we are taking as many audience questions as we can. Before we'll open it up to our discussion, I want to quickly introduce the panelists who live and breathe supply chains, and due to the fact that we have a panel that is dedicated to this. The global pandemic the last 2 years really showed how important, critical supply chains are, how interconnected the world is, and how important it is to coordinate potentially on vulnerabilities that we've seen, and the ongoing war in Ukraine sort of ties into this topic as well. You've seen the Europeans and the Biden administration coordinate and take pretty unprecedented action in choking off Russia's supply to critical goods. I don't want to take up too much of this time, so let me just introduce really quickly who's here with us. We have Kerstin Jona, who's the Director General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs at the European Commission. She has been leading and managed and oversaw the EU's reaction to the pandemic, in particular on supply chains and resilience. We have Peter Harrell with us, who's the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the National Security Council. Peter is also, I think, lives and dreams of supply chains every day. He's very much involved with the Europeans on the Trade and Technology Council, but he's also focused on China a lot. And then we have Luis Martinez Amago with us, who's the Deputy CEO of Technicolor and President and General Manager of the Connected Home Division. And his division provides the infrastructure for companies like Comcast and others to bring high-speed entertainment to your home. So if you watch Xfinity or have Comcast at your house, I believe you have a Technicolor router in your home. And with that, I'll give you panelists the chance to make introductory remarks, and let's start with Kerstin and go down to Luis.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you very much for your interest. I've brought a conference prop. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. This is a thermoscientific bio-container bag. And I brought it because this was one of the epiphany moments which we had in the pandemic. Because when the pandemic broke out, we were scrambling, all of us were scrambling for vaccines. Now, what existed at the time were 170 great ideas, roughly, nothing regulatory approved, some in clinical testing. And what the EU managed to do for the first time, remember we're 27 countries, actually we managed to buy together for all our citizens. So we had this beautiful contract. We had identified 6 among the 170 odd, which proved to be the right ones. We had the contract, we had the budget, we put together the supply chain, the production of the vaccines, the finish and filling, and then for the mRNA vaccines, you also need to have the logistics because it needs to be cold, very cold, cool logistics. We had the member states setting up the vaccination centers, and then happened this. We didn't have these bags because you connect them to the machines, and this is where they mix the vaccines. Now we asked the companies, where do you get these bags? From the United States. So we said, okay. We phone the company in the United States and say, well, could you give us, I don't know how many bags? And they said no. They said no because Defense Act, we need to keep the bioreactor bags in the US. It could have jeopardized the whole operation. Now, obviously, we phoned and we discussed and we made sure that we all understood without the bags we wouldn't be able to produce the vaccines that were then shipped also to the US. And what we learned from it is, number one, you need to know your supply chain. There's always this item that you never thought about. And number two is you have to work together. around the supply chain and help each other. Because the bigger you can scale your supply chain, the more you can produce. We moved from 35 million doses per month to something close to 400 now. So this just to explain our epiphany moment. What we do now is three things, the triple M, which is map, monitor, and muscle up the supply chains. Mapping, and we've been doing that together in a number of areas like raw materials, like energy, like all the material that you need to decarbonize the industry, hydrogen, pharmaceutical products. So that's the mapping. What we see now is that just knowing what you need and where you get it from is not enough. You also need to monitor whether in the course of the business operation, the economy, this actually stays and whether you have enough. And we have the current situation, Jenny, which you already mentioned, the war in Ukraine, which means that a number of inputs are no longer coming. And then the third thing is to muscle up the supply chain so that we're sure that also in crisis we're able to handle it. That's, for example, for raw materials, to be sure that we have the raw materials available, that we have partnerships and be able to source the raw materials, maybe be able to recycle them. I have one example, which is batteries. You know, the mobility ecosystem will require cars, will require batteries, and there will be a huge kind of increase of the need for batteries. And we had 0 batteries 3 years ago in Europe. We've built a battery alliance where we brought the whole value chain together. We have now something like 20 going on 30 gigafactories for batteries. We're now looking into the supply chain. Yes, you need lithium. We didn't have lithium, but now we're starting to also source lithium inside the EU. And this is how it comes together. And then next, so we kind of muscled up the supply chain for batteries by bringing the supply chain actors together, by de-risking with our budgets some part of the operations, and by sourcing the raw materials. The next big thing, if you ask me, is solar. And because we need, if we decarbonize our energy system, we need, in our industrial system, we need to leverage the solar power. If you imagine, you know, a normal sheet of paper like it comes out of your printer, and you imagine a quarter, you know, your little coin, in one of the corner, the quarter is the global energy demand today. The white paper is the potential of the sun. So we have to leverage that. And that means building, again, also in the US, a supply chain from scratch, because most of it, solar panels come from China, all of it. And it's a very complicated supply chain. We have technologies today which have a much higher efficiency of the solar panels than the previous ones. And that's what we have to build. And that I see as the next challenge. And I hope to be working very much together from the beginning on this with you.
Thank you. Well, thanks. And I really want to thank the European Union for inviting me to be here today. And thanks to all of you for coming to this panel. You know, I think most Americans probably didn't think about supply chain issues prior to about March of 2020 when we ran out of toilet paper. You know, maybe if you were in corporate sourcing, you were thinking about, okay, where's my stuff coming from? But you were really just thinking about how does it show up, you know, on time so the shelves are full, whether it's for Christmas season or something year round. And then, you know, when the pandemic hit and we saw just fundamental changes, both in kind of supply chains where things are coming from, and also on demand side where there were major changes in demand for goods. You know, we just saw the world of supply chains start to crack up a little bit, and as I say, I think for most of it was kind of empty shelves at the supermarket here. But the story of the last 2 years, I think, has been one of continued iterative supply chain challenges. You know, last year we saw the semiconductor shortage, driven both by plant shutdowns in Asia, where COVID outbreaks were shutting down semiconductor manufacturing, and also by a long-term kind of underinvestment in semiconductor manufacturing combined with a huge new demand for semiconductors. You know, we've seen challenges over the last year around shipping, both maritime freight shipping and around ground transportation here in the U.S. And I fear, as Kirsten alludes to with the war in Ukraine, we're likely to see a new set of supply chain challenges as companies stop buying metal from Russia, as Ukraine is unable to export various component parts that were used around the world for manufacturing. And so I think the last couple of years has seen us really need to fundamentally assess our supply chain vulnerabilities and think about supply chain issues in a new way. And I think on the part of the U.S. government, we've really been thinking about this in two broad buckets of areas. I agree. I think actually Kirsten has it right, because we do start with a mapping exercise. But when we think about solving the challenges, we've been thinking about one bucket that's kind of short-term disruptions. How can we solve the shipping challenges, the port congestion challenges, the shortages of truck drivers, kind of in the short-term kind of things. And then we think about the long-term, how do we make new investments, both here at home, but also very much with our allies and partners, to build resilient supply chains in a world where I think we have to expect both kind of natural disasters and geopolitics are going to play more and more of a role in disrupting global supply chains. And so in the short term, we've been, as I say, focused on a couple of things, particularly on the shipping and freight and logistics sector, to try to clear out over-cluttered ports, make sure containers are moving, ramp up hiring for truck drivers, and just kind of make sure the operations and logistics are running faster. And then on the long term, we're starting a set of investments both here in the U.S. and, as I say, with our allies and partners across a set of key goods. So just to highlight a couple of those, we've had a real focus on, as I say, semiconductors, right, where there's a shortage, partly because of sort of shutdowns, but also long-term underinvestment. And so we've mounted a campaign here in the U.S. To encourage semiconductor manufacturing. And since the beginning of 2021, semiconductor firms have announced about $80 billion in new investment in semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. Similarly, as Kirsten says, we've been focused on batteries. We're not going to be buying combustion engine cars in 15 years. We're all going to be buying electric cars. That requires a fundamentally new supply chain with a whole different set of technologies and component input parts. And we've seen over the last year automotive companies, both U.S. automotive companies, but also global automotive companies that make things here in the U.S. have announced about $100 billion of plans to build electric vehicle manufacturing capacity here in the U.S. So we've been promoting domestic investments in key supply chain products. But as I say, it's something we can't do alone, and nor would we want to do it alone. So Kristen brought up critical minerals, right? The stuff that's going to go into these batteries. And we think we've been working with allies and partners to develop sustainable sourcing and mining both here, but also around the world, to make sure that with our allies and partners we have access to lithium and cobalt and nickel and some of the other key commodities that go into it. I agree that solar is going to be a huge piece of this, and we've been trying to promote solar manufacturing here in the U.S. As Kirsten says, almost all of it is currently made in China. But we've also been thinking about an allied-based approach. And so last year in December, the Development Finance Corporation, which is a government body that provides international development finance, announced a $500 million deal with a U.S. solar manufacturing company to build a new facility in India. Sort of showing how we can build with our allies and partners production capacity, which will sell solar panels not only to the United States, but around the world as we look to reduce our dependency on some of the Chinese supply chain, which we fear has a lot of sort of forced labor concerns in Xinjiang out of it. And so I think that you're going to see us across both the near term and the long term continue to want to work with our allies and partners as we continue to go through what I think is going to be a really major kind of shift in how governments, how companies in the private sector, and how consumers as well are thinking about supply chain and where actually our goods come from.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for being here. I will represent the industry in this panel. So we are shipping millions of boxes of consumer electronic equipment from different companies to different companies. And my first comment is what we are seeing today due to COVID or the semiconductor crisis is not the start. I think it's evident for you all because it has been of a certain dimension that is exposing the difficulties we are having, but we are suffering supply chain crisis already for the last 5 years. It was before the memory crisis in consumer electronics. It was a component called LMLCC. It's a very small capacitor that we use by the thousands in the products we produce that was in shortages 3 years ago, much before COVID, and that was creating a significant disruption, and on and on and on. The point is with COVID, the demand profile changed a lot. We all started to spend more in electronics that instead of spending in trips, hotels, or restaurants, and that created a peak of demand that is difficult to follow by the industry for a number of reasons. But I would like to differentiate here what we call tactical challenges from structural challenges. In the tactical one is when you have demand, yes, you may have bottlenecks in ports or in transportation overall. We may be missing containers, and then we need to act on it. Okay, and with the support of governments, we can act on it. We are missing also truck drivers in a number of countries. So those are things that the industrial companies, we can put actions in place to make it more flexible and to solve this type of temporary bottlenecks. But for me, the most important thing is the structural problem. And the structural problem is the result of what all companies have been doing over the last 20 years, searching for efficiency and productivity. We have fragmented our value chain, and things that we used to do 30 years ago has been fragmented and delegated to single actors. Okay, if we go to the semiconductor problem, is 30 years ago, most of the semiconductor firms, like Intel, Texas Instruments, and all others, they have their own foundries, the factories of the wafers. But over a period of time, there was a company in Taiwan that was taking all this type of production, investing billions of dollars in making the best foundry in the world, and all these firms started to subcontract this to these people. Same companies like us started to produce in China or in Asia in general because it was more efficient, cheap labor, a lot of flexibility, a country investing in infrastructure to make production very efficient. But this is driving us to a situation of dependency and lack of flexibility that, in my opinion, we need to address. The big question here is, over the next 2 years, we need to fix the crisis we are suffering, and we are on it together with governments. But I think we need to rethink how we do things. There are companies verticalizing operations back again, people like Walmart or Amazon. They are even buying their own containers because there was a big issue with containers in the world, and people are trying to verticalize to get control. Tesla is trying to own mines and the raw material because they believe this is a competitive advantage. So in my opinion, the real challenge is how the industry, together with governments, we can put the new policies in place to, let me say, maybe it's not very popular, not being that naive with globalization, because globalization is good with everybody plays under the same rules, and there are countries not paying the same rules and taking advantage now. We need to put emphasis in efficiencies, but also in resilience of the supply chain. And one thing goes against the other. We're thinking in reshoring some of the activities, meaning moving production out of Asia to other places, not only because of dependency. Geopolitical situations may create situations which are very difficult to manage in the near future, and we need to be prepared today. It may happen in 5, 7, 3, we don't know, but it will happen. So we need to make this flexibility, and it goes deep in the supply chain. It's not only production, it's components that are only produced today in Asia, and we need to make an infrastructure that we become more flexible, that will have also an impact in carbon footprint. The closer we produce, the carbon footprint will go down. So it's all about innovation, but we need the support of governments because we are competing with Chinese, Taiwanese, Asian companies, and we need to make sure that we have the right infrastructure to remain competitive.
Let me start with the crisis of the day, obviously, the war in Ukraine, and to apply what lessons you've learned, and this is for Kirsten and Peter to begin, over the last 2 years dealing with the multifaceted supply chain disruptions. Is there something you've learned that you could successfully already have deployed in the context of the war? For you two?
Sure. So I guess my lesson is, you need to think even bigger than you think you need to think. And I mean that in the following way. So we were aware, and you'd seen in the news publicly going back to sort of November, December, we were aware that Russia was looking to invade Ukraine. And we obviously were aware that could mean, obviously first and foremost, a sort of disastrous tragedy for the people of Ukraine, but that could mean supply chain disruptions, right? It could mean disruptions around stuff that's being sourced out of Ukraine, and it could mean disruptions around stuff being sourced out of Russia. And so we'd actually done a kind of mapping exercise of, okay, what do we get out of here in the US? Like, what are we importing from Ukraine and Russia that might be impacted if there's a conflict? And we started reaching out to companies that were getting kind of key products out of Russia and Ukraine, like our aerospace manufacturers were getting a lot of titanium out of Russia. They were getting palladium. Automotive guys were getting palladium out of Russia. And we started saying, guys, you should be stocking up, thinking about diversifying your supply chains and that kind of thing. And I think we've actually, did a pretty good job on sort of identifying these key things that our importers were dependent on, and giving people a couple of months to diversify. What we didn't anticipate was the kind of broader way in which broader markets would start going haywire. So like we've seen the price of nickel go up by like 2.5 times because Russia's a big nickel producer and no one wants to buy any. We haven't imposed sanctions that would prevent you from buying nickel from Russia, but nobody wants to buy anything from Russia right now. And so the price of nickel's gone haywire. Obviously energy prices have gone up quite a bit, which we were aware of and planning against. But some of the other commodities, we just didn't anticipate the way the market would just shut down. So it was sort of, we thought we'd understood the universe of things that would be impacted here, and I think took some constructive steps to address them, but we hadn't thought big enough about how wide the impacts could be, and now we're trying to play catch up on a couple of these key markets.
I think from our point of view, we did the mapping and the kind of monitoring we started, but what is now useful is that we developed some muscle with the experience of the COVID pandemic. So the muscle means, for example, use the single market for absorbing part of the shock, because the shock that the companies see is they're not getting their inputs. They're not getting the inputs, for example, for metal producing. They are not getting the inputs, which is cable harnesses for the automotive sector. And a couple of others, and that's a direct impact. And then the second direct impact is that they lose markets in Russia because of the sanctions. So what we're trying to do is to activate our clusters. We have something like 1,200 clusters of companies and regions that work together, and that worked very well in the COVID crisis also together, to absorb some shocks, to be able, like we had in the COVID, who has a machine, who has, well, the bioreactor bags we didn't have, but other ingredients, so they could help each other out. And we are monitoring and we are kind of animating that process. Then the question is supplies, not linked to Russia, but in fact to China, is that 3 months ago China said, sorry guys, we have no more magnesium for you. We depend for almost 100% on Chinese magnesium. Now, the magnesium, you need it to do metals. It's an alloy. So what we did there is we brought together the member states who actually have magnesium mines in Europe and refineries, but who are no longer working. And we're discussing with them to reopen them again and to have at least access to a critical mass of magnesium. So the muscle that we developed, we will have to continue to develop it. But I also agree with you, the knock-on effects. We had looked at inputs and export markets, but the knock-on effects in the supply chains, that went faster than we had actually thought. And again, I think when it comes to absorbing the shock, it's good that we have, conversations between ourselves, and we have the two biggest markets, and I mean, that's a gigantic shock absorber as well for our companies to readjust the value chain. But of course, in the first place, it's for the companies as well. And it's true, Louis, I think that we'll have to think about the business case of a number of value chains. And it's a good moment, actually, because in Europe we have this, we call the twin transition, to decarbonize our economy by 2050, very ambitious targets also for 2030, and to digitize. And so it's a kind of reset moment already. And now it all comes together to think about it. Maybe one more word. We have transition pathways. So we look at all industrial ecosystems, and we look, what does it take for you to have a business case for this transition? Inputs, skills, finance, technologies, regulation, to be able to accompany that rethinking of the business case.
Just one follow-up to that. Has the crisis now shown you, yes or no, if governments need more work to be more nimble in a situation like this, where you map it out, but then you still don't go big enough, or you still don't think about the knock-on effects? Is there something more that you can do, you think, that to respond to the next crisis, which inevitably will come?
Yes, I think we've had years of the government's role is to do the enabling environment, and then the rest happens on its own. What we learn now is that enabling and means accompanying, and as I said, the twin transition means also that it's a big shift in our economy, in the way we produce and the way we consume, and that has to be accompanied, and that's where you need public-private partnership. So it's more of a partnership approach than dividing the role. The government enables and the industry acts. I see that coming more together.
And for me, the request to governments is, again, to separate the tactical measures, raw material or the crisis of today, and they're very good things done for the countries, sometimes impacting us. For example, in the chips, you both prioritize chips going to automobile industry that was penalizing other industries. Fine, because you have factories in the countries that should be active. I understand that. But for me, the main difference, and I live in China, run a company in China for a period of time, is the long-term planning, which in my opinion, this is one of the problems we have. When there is a country with a very long-term planning in many aspects, and we have governments, a system that is not that stable in planning, I think for these type of things, the chips, that you're investing a ton of money in bringing chip production in Europe and the US, I think we need to do more in other areas, but it's multi-year planning. Nothing will happen in the span of 2 years. This is plans for 6, 7, 10 years, and it's not only chips, it's many other things we need to do. And my request will be to really have a very long span of time in planning, because in industries, you invest not for the next year, you invest for a long period of time, and you need certain predictability. We are competing with China. We were using them because of the cheap labor in a number of activities, but they have developed a number of key competencies in the electronic industry. We are competing with them. It's not about reshoring activity, because we can reshore activity, but we are going to be competing with them with this type of product. We need to be competitive, and this we need the support and the help in making us competitive, playing in our own terms.
So I could not agree more with what Luis just said. I mean, I look at this as, I'm a short-termer in government. I'm a political appointee. I worked on the president's campaign, came in, I got a maximum tenure of a couple of years. But supply chains is something we need to have institutionalized. We need a long-term focus on supply chains. It can't just be sort of left up to me and my successor, whoever that is, to kind of maintain this. And that's why, from an American perspective, the president has asked Congress to do two things this spring related to supply chain. One of which is to set up a sort of a permanent office at the U.S. Department of Commerce that would have a couple $100 million a year budget to engage in long-term mapping and also sort of organizing the industry in key ways around supply chain views. And then alongside this office, he's been asking for $45 billion fund that would actually help make some investments, some seed capital in key supply chains. And it's coming from exactly that perspective. We actually need to have an institutionalized, permanent, staff of experts who can really help drive that kind of long-term planning that we all need if we're going to, A, ever get out of the tactical disruptions, and B, effectively compete with China on supply chain issues.
Luis, is there a practical case where you can sort of explain how governments should balance prescribing the reshoring or prescribing what they would want to see? The U.S. has, the U.S. and the EU on the CHIPS case, of course, has these programs now to help companies, invest at home. When you talk about flexibility that needs to be built in so that companies in the real world can actually respond to these crises, what is your ask there for governments to balance what they prescribe, what strings come attached with the help that they give companies and leaving the flexibility to?
I think we need to agree what are our weaknesses first, okay? And one thing is labor cost. And okay, I'm not proposing to reduce the labor cost in here, but then we need to invest in a number of technologies that make us less dependent on labor cost, and that means automation is what the Japanese has been doing with robotics. They invested in robotics not to be nice, is because they had a problem of labor availability in the country, and they said that they don't like immigration a lot, so they have to automate in order to keep their factories open. I think we need to make sure that we compete in our own terms. We're not going to compete in reducing the minimum salary, but we need to compete in investing in robotics, in making the dark factories, in being able to do this type of things. And the second area is competencies. Okay, these people in let's say, East, you see the type of people that they are putting in universities, the degrees, the specialization in certain areas like manufacturing, etc., is amazing. And the way these people compete and they are trained is unbeatable. If we try to do the same in Europe or US, I don't think that these type of skills, because we abandoned production of electronics a long time ago, we need to reinvest and convince people that this is a nice profession to do and animate people to do that and keeping the universities competitive. I think we need to force people to really give the value that a competence, a title has, and that we are there competing with other people that maybe they are using the different values in terms of competitiveness in the world. We need to regain this. I think we're shifting to a different type of values or competence. We need to regain that because it's critical. If not, we're going to be suffering this type of dependencies with the East for a long period of time. And that is very risky for many aspects, from business point of view and maybe geopolitical point of view.
Maybe from the European angle, we've developed what we call the Pacts for Skills. I mean, it's university, but it's also lifelong learning. And these pacts for skills, which we bring together in the industrial ecosystems, is workers and companies to identify the skills for tomorrow. For example, in the battery value chain, we will lack 800,000 at least qualified people to do that. And what they came up with is the idea of a battery academy. So this battery academy, which has a kind of broad curriculum, and is available for people who are already on the job. They've already trained 150,000 people. And it's kind of financed by the industry. It's agreed between the companies and the workers. And that's why it works, I think. And the investment is being made.
Kerstin, you also talked about the fact that you're building some industries from scratch that have sort of all been outsourced to China, and you mentioned solar and batteries as one example. How do you weigh investing, reshoring, or incentivizing investment at home with also restricting imports from China to compete? How do you weigh this? How much you do play offense versus defense, and how that impacts companies in the real world?
Well, I mean, my team, it's really the team of the business case. So we're trying to look at the business case of it. And the business case, of course, means innovation, you need the technology. Sometimes you don't have it, then you have to invest in research and investment. Sometimes you have it, but you need to scale it. It means investment, and not just investment like we did in the past. Here's the grant, here's the subsidy. It's really de-risking, and government can play a much more active role in the de-risking part, where we only guarantee certain parts of the risk, the first loss piece or mezzanine, whatever, and in that way, there is already, you get the investment going. Then, of course, you also need, for investors to come in, you need predictability and certainty. And that's what you create with regulation. And with regulation, you can create, of course, the standards. And when you create the standards, what we are doing, for example, with our battery regulation, which is currently in the legislative process, we create standards around where is the material sourced, and how is it sourced? Is it sustainably sourced? How much can you recycle of this battery? Where do you get the standards? So we create this level playing field for batteries in Europe, which means batteries that are imported into Europe, they have to comply with these rules as well. And then there is a last point to competitiveness. We are having a battery alliance, and as I said, it's the whole value chain, including the off-takers. So big off-takers for batteries are the car industry, for example. So by bringing them in already in the beginning, it also means that there is a bigger business case. And that then builds the very strong business case, and we are expecting to actually export batteries in the coming 2 years, as of the coming 2 years. And we build it from scratch.
Staying really quickly on the China topic, the Biden administration has billed almost every initiative that has come out so far as an effort to compete with China, or to, I don't want to say contain China, but to run faster than them, and in some cases stop them from running so fast. The Europeans are usually a little bit more hesitant to label it that. And in your work coordinating on these issues, Peter and Kerstin, is this just semantics, or is this a real hurdle to overcome in achieving the same goal, if you do have the same goal?
Well, I think we both want a business case for our companies. If we had a policy which was about China not having a business case, that would be not, that's not a policy. The policy is to have a business case in the US, in Europe, to have our companies create quality jobs, and to be sure that we can compete, and that Lewis can compete. So I think it's a broader policy, and we cooperate very well.
Yeah, no, I think we have a very good cooperative relationship with the European Union across a whole range of supply chain issues. I mean, I think when it comes to China, look, I think from an American perspective, as you said, like, we're in an era of geopolitics again, right? I mean, I think many of us, at least sort of here on the panel, right, kind of came up in like the world is flat era, right, to quote Tom Friedman. And that's just not the era we're in anymore. We're in an era of geopolitics. You've seen that with China over the last couple of years. You're seeing that in spades with Russia today. And in a world of geopolitics where it's sort of not going to be flat politically, it's not going to be flat economically, in a world of competition, like, you don't win a competition unless you run faster than the other guy, right? And that really is why we have started our China policy by making investments here at home, because it's the right thing to do for the American people first and foremost, and for our allies and partners, and also just because, like, we can try all we can to trip the Chinese up, but unless we're running faster than they are, we're not going to win that competition. So you're absolutely right, and we need it. You got to start with the smart domestic investments. You got to build a talented workforce. You got to bring your allies on board with you if you want to win what we think is probably going to be a pretty, long-term competition and geopolitical world.
It's not only faster; it's better as well. We have the better products. When you look at mining, I mean, the work we are doing about sustainable mining, allowing the countries where raw materials are sourced to also go up the value chain and have, also some refining operations, transfer of technology, we can do that. And that's why, in the end, our offer to these countries will be better. than an offer that just comes with a big bag of money and workers from China or from wherever.
I want to open it up to the audience. Why don't we go you in the back there?
Hi, great panel. Thank you so much.
I think you're getting a microphone. 1 second.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Nice panel, great panel. I came here because I'm really interested in hearing about supply chain lessons. I work at MIT in a cybersecurity management research group, and I'm interested in your thoughts and maybe lessons on the cybersecurity angle that our supply chains are introducing. I mean, I understand supply chains are about moving stuff and sourcing. I mean, that's certainly important, but even when the stuff isn't moving, the digits are. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we're going to keep our supply chains from cyber vulnerabilities like we've seen over the last year with Colonial Pipeline, which was a stuff one, or SolarWinds, which was a digital one. What are your thoughts on the cybersecurity of our supply chain?
Okay, in the industry, we are protecting ourselves. This is very high, and we're investing a lot in protecting our systems. But we are exposed in the whole supply chain, because when we are using other partners, either for logistics or for production, etc., we are instructing them in getting as high in protection as we are, but these companies are all over the world, and some of them are based in Vietnam, China, Taiwan, etc. So it is not that easy to guarantee that all of them are protected. So there are risks. For the moment, we have not suffered any crisis due to cybersecurity, but okay, it's a real topic because that can create disruptions that can impact everybody.
Well, governments are also running operations, and we have to protect our operations, and that's a big highlight in our policy, how we protect critical infrastructure run by governments, how are the crisis protocols, how's the analysis, which starts with the fact, what kind of systems do we buy and do we procure, and in the past this has been seen, everybody had to take care of their own kind of operation. Now we see much more member states, the 27 countries really working together on this. And this is also part of our standardization strategy. We have a rather unique system of standardization, which is not comparable to the US. And in this standardization system, we have an annual union work program every year. And the cyber issues and the standards to ensure cybersecurity, to also then allow for companies to buy the components against these standards is one of the priorities, and where we will work very strongly this year and next year.
I just say, I think the two cases you brought up, probably particularly Colonial Pipeline hack, was a real wake-up call of this isn't just about sort of, maybe a institution has to pay a ransom, which you never want to have happen, but like actually major parts of the economy can be shut down pretty much overnight as a result of this. And I think it was a real wake-up call. And I think you've seen here in the US government try to lean in more aggressively, both in terms of encouraging companies through a variety of both like inducement and coercive mechanisms to increase their own cybersecurity posture. And you've also seen us leaning in more on what you might call kind of tactical threat cooperation. So, I talked a little bit earlier about the way in which, going back to December, we had begun engaging with industries that were importing from Russia and Ukraine on supply chain vulnerabilities. Our Department of Homeland Security cyber team had actually, about the same time, started engaging with critical infrastructure companies to recommend kind of a shields up posture on cybersecurity, recognizing this, worry about Russian cyber attacks and that kind of thing. And so I think it sort of was a wake-up call. We need both sort of structurally to strengthen, but also tactically to be in a better, more forward-leaning posture with industry about threats we're seeing coming down the pipe.
Sure, here in the, yeah, go ahead.
All right, wonderful panel. Luis, you mentioned the trade-off that I thought about a lot. I used to work in supply chain consulting, and I found that people got paid to have less inventory, and no one ever got paid to have more resiliency. And so I'm curious, how does the panel or industry think about incentivizing resiliency in a sort of a more fundamental way? Things like maybe having more stock than you need to. That's a trivial example, but just one that I'd like you guys to stew on. Thank you.
This is a very, very good question, because what I did in my company is, and it's not now, over the last 2 years because of COVID, even before, is culture of the people. And the people, not only the supply chain, the whole thing is problems will happen every single day. And at the beginning, when the people comes to you complaining, you ask, are you going to cry? And then the point is, you come, we need to realize the problem, come with an action plan. And it's a mentality of how we can make every process more resilient. And when we see things failing, we may need to have tactical inventories, which is extremely bad for us because it's a lot of tension in cash, because creating inventory, you need to pay for them before you collect from customers. But yes, in a number of, if you detect that a component or a family of components is going to be a problem, and it may be in the future with geopolitical challenges, is we may need to stock a number of components in case there is disruption that we can still produce for a number of months. But it's one example. There is many, many examples. It's about IT automation. Previously, 4 years ago, we were tracking just the suppliers, the direct suppliers we had. Now we are going deep in the suppliers of our suppliers of our suppliers. So if there is a disruption in Nigeria, now we have systems that tell us that some of our suppliers are using something coming from Nigeria, and we need well in advance in order to create recovery things. So it's about a lot of process automation, but most importantly is the culture of the teams, that they need to be prepared that life is difficult. There is no time to cry or whine about problems. This is the problem, what do we do about it? It's honesty with customers. Normally, it's very difficult to go to your customers and tell them you're not going to supply or you're going to supply less. You need to be transparent with them to say, this is the problem, this is what we are doing, and this is the corridor in which we see worst to best, and we are going to keep you informed, because customers are big corporations, the Comcast, Charter, Orange, or BT. So you need to tell these people what is the range of possibilities, because they need to prepare themselves. If we don't serve products, they don't sell services, so you need to be very honest. So it's a combination of many things. You are an expert in supply chain, but in my opinion, it's automation, deep inspection of your whole supply chain, culture of your people, and honesty and transparency with the customers in bad times, because they need to be aware of what could happen and prepare themselves.
Hi, thanks for the panel. It was great. Two questions. When you think about what happened at the financial crisis, there was an effort to do system-wide stress tests. Is that something you could consider, looking at the systemic and network nature of supply chains, to look at where the systemic weaknesses are, rather than just looking at the mapping exercise and make it more dynamic? That's the first question. Second question, I think both the US and EU have talked about strategic partnerships, in other words, trade with strategically aligned countries and nations. How do you define that? And with in mind that US and the EU have had a strained relationship over the last 4 years, and how do you define a strategically aligned country and nation? Thanks.
Stress testing, yes. In a way, the deep dives that we've been doing on a number of products and technologies, and you as well, this is a form of stress testing. And it's not only mapping. Remember, it was a triple M I had, which is mapping, monitoring, and muscling up. So it's all three. Strategic partnership, it's obvious. I mean, we have two big economies. If they work together, and we were at another panel where I introduced the concept of co-shoring, not reshoring, but co-shoring. So that we make sure that one of us has these reactor bags, and that we have enough of them. So we're having these conversations. When it comes to strategic partnerships, of course, the raw materials issue is very prominent, because a number of raw materials, I mean, they're not in the US and they're not in the EU, they're somewhere else. And the question is how we can work together to make an offer when, for example, a mine in South America is being opened, how we can work together to make an offer for a license or sourcing from that mine, which is competitive with regard to other offers. And you know, the other offers, as I already mentioned, they often are big bags of money immediately, big loans, but they don't come with workforce training or work employment at all. They don't come with, you know, next steps on the value chain, some parts of refining and technology for refining. So we can actually make a better offer, and I think that in the future, that's one of the areas where we'll be able to work together very much.
So with regard to the semiconductors in particular, do any of you have any estimates or opinions or ideas on when, one, have we reached the worst part of the delay crisis or shortage crisis? And do you have any predictions on when we'll actually start to recover?
I can take my view, yes. I would like to know your opinion, but we were trying to convince ourselves that that will be fixed by the end of this year. But in my opinion, ain't gonna happen. I think we are gonna go to next year, and we are still having shortages. Additional capacity will become available as we speak in the second half of this year and next year. But it's much more complex than that because it's not semiconductors. There is different type of technologies, what we call nanometers, and depending how new is less nanometers, more integrated thing. So there may be parts of this semiconductor crisis that will become better. Some of them, mostly the less new technologies, will become still very short in supply well into 2023, okay? And after that, there are two crises. One is the crisis of availability, shortages. The other one is the crisis of price, okay? And we may be the availability being fixed over 2023 timeframe. The prices, maybe it will be later than that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I have probably a fairly similar view. And it's been interesting with the semiconductor crisis. As Luis says, actually, the worst shortages have not been the leading edge chips, the sort of highest tech chips. The worst shortages have been some of the older model chips that were really heavily used in industrial things like cars that don't necessarily need like the leading edge kind of chip the way your cell phone does. And the thing is, like, getting manufacturers, for the last 30 years, manufacturers have always been making their investment in the leading edge, right? They've been like, we're always moving towards smaller chips. And so their mentality and investment cycle has all been leading edge. And the shortage has been in mature, sort of legacy technology. And so getting the manufacturers like invest in the older technology to expand production there, it's just not something they're used to. And so it's been a bit of a sea change there. I do think we're seeing more capacity come online. And I think we're going to continue to see more capacity come online. So I think, we are probably past the very worst of it right now, but I agree, it's going to be I think a while before we're really able to kind of not have this sort of get back to normal in terms of the companies that are using semiconductors.
And the amount of investment these people are doing in capacity is crazy. Yeah. We are talking about billions of dollars based on a scenarios of demand. That is what we were having before all the things we are living today. So not the big, we are committing, we are placing orders already for a year. So we are ordering the chips today that we are going to build a product next April. So you can imagine our forecasting window is extremely long. We are betting at the demand. I don't want to go to a discussion about the inflation and the impact of inflation in consumers' demand, etc. But I think we are in a complex world that the industry, we are betting in a scenario, investing billions of dollars for a potential demand that maybe is today a bit more questionable than 2 months ago.
So actually, just one last point. So a semiconductor that goes in your cell phone actually might take 25 weeks to manufacture. That's like once capacity is online, the actual manufacturing cycle of that thing might be 25 weeks, which is why you have these long, plus all the time to bring more capacity online, which is why you have these long lead times. But to give you an idea, because you bring up inflation, and I think we're all worried about inflation and the sort of headline numbers we've seen. But last year, 2021, right, where we had much higher than usual inflation, our estimates are like a third of the increase in inflation was due to automotive prices surging. And the only reason automotive prices surged was the semiconductor shortage, right? So like basically a third of the increase in inflation we saw last year was due to the semiconductor shortage, which is why we're so focused on solving this problem.
But if I may say, we need better demand planning on the side of the industry, because between 25 weeks and 1 year is too short. And we are currently conducting a survey actually with industry. We need to have longer term planning. You know, we need to know in 5 years what's the semiconductors that you will need, you know, and what specificities. Because it's by understanding the demand, you can have the better policies then also.
Hi, yes, I know we've mostly focused on the technological supply chain, but I'm curious if anyone could speak to the global food supply chain, particularly as Ukraine is such a major producer of wheat and the impacts that that's going to have in the coming months.
So I'm really worried about this, being candid. You know, Ukraine produced about 8% of the world's wheat, as you say, last year. And it's not being exported right now. It's not even being produced right now because of the conflict, right? And I think that there's probably not, you know, unfortunately, we're probably going to see a lot of loss this year in that. Now, you know, here in the U.S., obviously we're a huge wheat producer. We're not, you know, we are going to have plenty of supply, but you're going to see impact on price. And then in places like Egypt and, you know, North Africa, where you've had a lot of dependence on Ukrainian wheat, I worry about shortages. So, you know, we are doing a couple of things with our allies and partners. You know, one is to make clear that countries that have wheat, like the U.S. and Argentina and Europe, shouldn't be hoarding. We should make sure that, you know, countries that need wheat, other food, are able to go out and buy it. You know, we're also working at how can we try to expand some planting and production this year. That's all hard because of where we are in the planting cycle, but we're looking at things we can do there. And then countries that have strategic supplies, like India, like China, you know, hopefully can put some of the strategic stockpiles on the market to help stabilize prices. This is something we're quite concerned about, particularly with some of the developing market countries that, you know, had been buying a lot of that Ukrainian wheat.
I totally confirm. It's not an issue as such for Europe and food in Europe, but it's an issue for our neighbors, and that's why we are focusing on it. I can, however, also say that we are currently discussing with Ukraine sending seeds, because they are planning, and this shows, this is just another, you know, proof of their incredible resilience and their incredible courage, actually. So there are parts of Ukraine where they do want to seed, and they will want to get working on the wheat, and we're cooperating with them to have them seeds available so that they can do that and at least have part of the production also going. But at the same time, it is important that we all work together to make sure Middle East, Northern Africa, Egypt in particular, that there is no shortage and no fear of shortage as well.
Let's try one or two more audience questions.
Hi there. Thank you for your insights. 90% of the carbon emissions of hard goods come from the transport, not the supply. 69% of oil products go into transportation. 20% of the world's carbon emissions are moving people and product around the world. Yet I don't think the actual transportation part of the supply chain gets as much attention as perhaps it should in terms of the whole sustainability story and what we're doing in terms of investment in that space. And I would be really interested in your insights on what you're thinking about in those areas.
Well, I can answer for Europe. That's clearly part of our work. We have the Fit for 55 package, which is 14 regulations, different proposals for regulation. The objective is to reduce our carbon emissions by 55% in 2030. That's why it's Fit for 55. And the transport sector has a very important role. I mean, we are proposing to include it in the emission trading system. That's already one thing. There are proposals on creating an alternative fuel infrastructure. There are proposals about creating the zero emission plane. So there's a lot around the transport sector where 2030. But you know, 2030 is 2 investment cycles away for a company. Yes? No? The plan is for 2030. Not all of them, but I mean, to have the technology ready to actually fly.
I have a question about strategic allies. You all mentioned that this is incredibly important if we're to be competitive, particularly against China. Wondering if you can speak a little bit to Africa, the continent of Africa, where China has made massive inroads. We have AGOA coming up in 25 for the US in terms of trade, and I'm just curious what the partnership is here to create more of a strategic ally with Africa, given their potential for raw materials.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's easy to talk about Africa as one continent, but obviously there are actually a bunch of countries with a lot of different relationships, a lot of different political systems, and many of which actually over the last number of years have been among the fastest growing economies in the world. And so I think what's actually been really heartening from an American policymaker perspective is to see how much interest we're seeing on the corporate side, driven first and foremost by the growth opportunities in Africa for US companies to invest in, whether it's like IT startups in Nigeria or mining in further in sort of South Central Africa. But I think the corporate sector sees you know, a lot of new opportunity, Western corporate sector in Africa. And certainly we think, particularly as companies might diversify away from China for like light manufacturing and textiles and some of these other things, there's a lot of further opportunity to do that. Now we have to get the policy environment right? We have to, you know, kind of work to re-up AGOA. We have to work to kind of promote regional integration in Africa. But I think that if we can get the policy environment right, which is kind of our focus, I think the potential is there on the corporate side to really unlock a lot of sort of Western-facing business development in Africa over the next couple of years.
We had the EU-Africa summit 2 weeks ago, and it didn't end with a declaration, as these summits normally do, but with a, I don't know how you say in English, cahier de charge. So a kind of roadmap plan, who does what, and in which sectors to invest. And for example, on raw materials, we have 5 countries with whom we are developing now sustainable mining projects, and they are backed also by the government-to-government interaction about creating the right systems, making sure that the workers, the conditions are correct. There's a big financial package also that goes with it. And you know, coming back to my bag, we're also having a cooperation with 6 countries in Africa who want to and who are volunteering to develop vaccination hubs. And that means research and development, regulatory approval of the installations, logistics, and it all includes also technology transfer, cooperation with European companies whose intervention we are de-risking by, I mean, the government-to-government thing, but also by taking part in the investments that are necessary. So there's a very concrete cooperation starting up now.
I love that we can all talk about supply chains all day, but sadly I have to wrap it up here. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Maybe you can grab them on the way out if you still have more questions, but thank you very much all for showing up, and thank you to you panelists.
Sorry about that. I'm the one that has to keep the room moving, so I'm the big bad wolf right here. But there's plenty of food to enjoy outside in our beer garden. You can head straight through this doorway here, or there's coffee back in the bar. By all means, feel free to linger here while we chat with the panelists afterwards, continue the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have another panel starting at the top of the hour at 1 o'clock on the next generation and digital diplomacy. Thank you, everybody, once again for joining us, and we'll see you here in a few minutes.
Marihuana, Tirana, Albania, export, import, diaspora, everybody now turbomania, Rio, Maracana, Brasilia, Africa, India, Al Arabia, here and there and everywhere, go magnifico en compañía, here I come, here I go.